Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Putting the Story in History. Today, we're going to be talking about the invasion of Ukraine, and we're going to be giving you some historical context for this invasion and what really is kind of going on there. So, we're going to try to get you caught up and give you the most basic information you'll need to understand why this is happening and what's going on. This is in no way like a comprehensive video explaining everything, but it's going to give you some basic information that'll help you understand what's going on. So let's get started. Here's kind of a rough outline of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about Ukraine and its relationship with Russia, the dissolution of the USSR, which is going to kind of lead into this conflict, Ukrainian independence, Ukrainian disarmament, the Russian geopolitical strategy, the Ukrainian Revolution of 2013, the annexation of Crimea, the lead up to this year's invasion, talk a little bit about the invasion, and then how the world is responding and what that means. So let's get started. Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine's relationship with Russia is very long and complex. Okay, Ukrainians are distinct and separate people that have been their own ethnicity going all the way back to Kievan Rus. This is all the way back in before 1000 AD. Okay, Ukraine is at various times in its history been under direct control of Russian czars and dictators. So they have in the past been under the control of Russian forces. Okay, however, Ukraine has been an independent country since 1991 when the USSR dissolved. Okay, so recently it has been its own country, even though it has this long history of being a part of Russia. Let's talk a little bit about the dissolution of the USSR. This is the part that caused Ukrainian independence. The USSR, of course, was the Soviet Union, and it was formed after World War I and the Russian Civil War. During World War II, the Soviet Union conquered most of Eastern Europe in the process of defeating the Nazis, and that includes Ukraine. And then following that war, the USSR maintained Soviet satellite states throughout Eastern Europe, including Ukraine. Ukraine was actually part of the USSR. It was not a Soviet state. Satellite state. Ukraine was a Soviet socialist republic, and that was forced to have a communist government and economy because it was ruled by Russia. The USSR determined many aspects of their foreign policy and other aspects of their government. So they didn't have full or complete independence. They were under the thumb of the Soviet Union. If they refused to follow orders, there was always the threat of an invasion or other things happening to people in Ukraine. In the early 90s, the USSR began to fall apart, and Soviet satellite states like Ukraine gained independence for the first time as the USSR crumbled. Ukraine and many other countries that have been a part of the Eastern Bloc received aid from Western nations like the United States to rebuild and modernize their economies. So these countries that had slowly kind of economically slowed or deterred or fallen apart were being aided by Western nations in their recovery after communism. Let's talk a little bit more about Ukraine's independence. Ukrainians, for the first time, had a true democracy. They had never actually been given a choice in their government before. Ukraine also, for the first time in a long time, was a sovereign state, no longer dependent on Moscow. This is not just talking about the USSR, but also back into the Russian Tsar times. Okay? Ukraine's economy sputtered and slowed after independence and struggled for most of the 90s, but eventually, with a lot of help, rebounded and started to grow again. Ukraine was one of the founders of the Commonwealth of Independent States, which was basically a loose confederation of former Soviet republics. When the USSR fell apart, they created the Commonwealth of Independent States to kind of create that, kind of maintain that sort of connection with these former Soviet states, but it wasn't as rigorous as the USSR had been. So along with Belarus and Russia, they had founded the Commonwealth of Independent States. Russian sympathizers still existed in Ukraine and pushed for the Ukrainian government to have pro-Russian stances. So basically, there was these factions in the Ukrainian government that wanted Ukraine to still be a part of Russia. Okay? Russia believed that Ukraine was still Russian territory and should not be a sovereign nation. Remember, Russia has controlled Ukraine for centuries. So they still believe that Ukraine is theirs and that it shouldn't have its own sovereignty. Let's also talk about what happened to Ukraine's nuclear weapons. When the USSR collapsed, Ukraine briefly became the third largest nuclear power in the world. The United States, Russia, Ukraine. Okay. In 1994, Ukraine decided to give up its nuclear deterrent in the Budapest Memorandum. So 3 years after its independence, it was convinced to give up its nuclear weapons. This deal eliminated Ukraine's nuclear arsenal, with the caveat that Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States would guarantee Ukraine's security and sovereignty in the future. This is kind of a tricky part, right? Who are the people who are attacking Ukraine's sovereignty? Russia. Okay. The other two countries, the UK and the United States, haven't really actively been defending Ukraine as of right now. So this is kind of a big deal. Ukraine had a nuclear deterrent. Russia would never invade a country like Ukraine if it had all these nuclear weapons. So getting rid of this nuclear deterrent has really put Ukraine in a tough bind. Let's talk a little bit about why Russia wants Ukraine back. And we already talked about how Russia has controlled Ukraine for a long time, but that's part of what some social scientists would call a geopolitical strategy. Their strategic goal for the last 400 or 500 years has basically been to control land between Moscow and Western nations, whether those be puppet countries or actually physically controlling the land. They also build up military deterrence to stop attacks on Russia, and when possible, build alliances with like-minded nations. That is Russia's political strategy outside of Russia. They want these things to happen so they can be defended. And a lot of this came about because of the Napoleonic Wars. All the way back then, Napoleon actually invaded Russia and came very close to actually taking Moscow. The same thing happened in World War II. That's why these buffer states need to be there. That's the way Russia keeps itself safe. So let's take an example of what that might look like. As you can see here on this map, these are all the Eastern Bloc states of the USSR. And as you can see, Moscow is all the way over here. So that means that all these countries now, right, are in the way of Western nations who might want to invade Russia. So the USSR executed this strategy perfectly. It created puppet states in Eastern Europe, Germany, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania. It created alliances with like-minded nations like Yugoslavia and Cuba, and it controlled nations like Ukraine and Belarus and Moldova and Lithuania and all of them to create this buffer zone between the West and Russia, their enemies and themselves. Now let's go back to Ukraine. The Ukrainian Revolution happened in 2013. It was a revolution, kind of. It wasn't like, I guess it's a revolution, but it's not one that you'd think of. There wasn't like a war or fighting or anything. It was more a political one. The elections that had produced a pro-Russian candidate in Ukraine that wanted to build a further alliance with Russia instead of the rest of Europe. Ukrainians generally didn't like this, and so they demonstrated and protested, and after several months, a pro-Western leader was put in power. This pro-Western leader began attempts to join the EU and NATO in direct opposition to Russia's wishes. Basically, the Ukrainian people said, look, we don't want to be with Russia anymore. We want to be independent, and we want to join these European groups that are going to help us develop and become a better nation. Russia didn't like that. Okay, it basically meant that one of their buffer countries, Ukraine, was starting to become not their buffer country anymore. So how does Russia respond? Well, in 2014, Russian troops used their base in Sevastopol to annex Crimea. Crimea had been a Russian territory for a long time, but as of 1991, it was Ukrainian. This region used to be, right, like I said, under the direct control of Russia, but now, after they invaded, they held a controversial referendum which said that Crimea should be Russian. And so since 2014, Crimea has been held by Russian soldiers. At the same time, Russian militants and pro-Russian militias in eastern Ukraine seized control of two regions and declared them independent and started aligning themselves with Russia. Since 2014, there has been an armed conflict in these regions. Ukraine has continued to fight against this armed insurgency, so they are continuing to try to control these two areas that have been taken over by Russian militants. Now, in the lead up to this year's invasion, in January and February, Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, began to move Russia's military forces towards the Ukrainian border. Basically, they did this on the pretense that they were trying to de-escalate and de-arm this revolution happening in eastern Ukraine. Western nations like the United States, France, and the UK, and Poland condemned these actions and tried to pursue diplomatic solutions to Russia's apparent aggression. Basically, Russia was moving its troops into these areas, basically saying, hey, there's this armed conflict going on in eastern Ukraine. We're going to try to put a stop to it. And everybody said, no, that is obviously you saying you're going to invade Ukraine. That's not okay. You can't do that. Ukraine's sovereignty is important, etc., etc. Then what happens is on February 24th, Russian forces actually entered Ukraine from three directions, the north, the south, and the east, and Russian forces began bombing major cities and military installations in Ukraine. So basically, the Russian military launched an all-out assault on Ukrainian territory. Russian soldiers have already taken over the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in eastern Ukraine, and Ukrainians have begun fleeing west towards Poland to escape advancing Russian troops. So clearly, right, Putin's initial plan of saying, hey, we're just going to do a peacekeeping mission here has turned into an all-out assault on Ukraine. He's decided that he must control this country. Before the invasion began, Russia released a statement basically saying that anyone who actually gets in the way of their military action in Ukraine will face devastating consequences. Russia entered Ukraine with the official pretext of demilitarizing and denazifying the country, basically saying, they're not doing what we say, so we're going to say that they're bad and we're going to invade them because they are bad people. Russia believes that Ukraine is ultimately Russia's and does not deserve sovereignty, and the invasion of Ukraine is their attempt to reclaim lost Russian territory from the past. Since then, the world has responded as well as Ukraine. Ukrainian troops have continued to fight Russian forces in Ukraine, and Ukrainian citizens have stepped up to arm themselves and fight against Russians. There have been several kind of funny instances where Ukrainians have told Russian soldiers to, as funny as that is, this is a real conflict and a scary time for Ukraine. The United States, NATO, and the UN has already condemned Russia's actions and have begun implementing severe economic sanctions on Russia, their banks, Russian oligarchs, and Belarusians who are helping them. Some potential sanctions have not been put in place because Russia supplies all of its natural gas to Europe. Without that gas, Western Europe's economy would crash. So basically, Russia has the ability to kind of hold the Western Europe hostage because they supply their natural gas. NATO has reinforced its surrounding allies, but will not fight in Ukraine because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Since then, there have been other sanctions as well. For instance, FIFA and UEFA have canceled its affiliation with the Russians, basically saying Russia can't compete in the World Cup and Russian teams can't compete in European competitions for soccer, other kinds of things like that. Like I said, Ukraine has continued to fight for Ukraine's sovereignty, and Ukrainian troops are fighting Russian forces when possible. Like I said, also, Ukrainians are fleeing in great numbers west, and Ukrainians that have states are staying in bomb shelters and subway tunnels. Talking about people fleeing, people who are Ukrainian are getting through to Poland rather easily, while people who are maybe studying in Ukraine that are from like the Middle East or Africa are having a harder time getting out of Ukraine than white Ukrainians are. Here are some pictures of some of the things that have happened since Ukraine's in the invasion of Ukraine. Here's kind of a little diagram of where the Russians are coming. Here's a soldier standing guard. Here are some explosions in Kiev because it's being shelled. And here are Ukrainians trying to escape their neighborhood who have been bombed out. And then, of course, there's also been Russian protests in Russia over this war. As you can see, there have been lots of protests basically saying Putin shouldn't be doing this. However, he's doing it anyway. Here, President Biden announcing the sanctions against Russia, and here's a kind of a map of the countries that are imposing these sanctions. Basically, it's the EU, the UK, Germany, US and Canada, and Australia, as well as Japan. So the major economic countries in the world. Thank you guys so much for watching this brief and basic overview of the invasion of Ukraine. It's been excellent being able to inform you of all this stuff. If you love history, subscribe to my channel to learn more. My series, Putting the Story in History, is great because it teaches you all about history by telling stories. So it's not all facts and figures. It's a little bit more narrative. Thanks again so much for watching, and we'll see you soon with more history.